Today from the global lane, escalating tensions in the Middle East after the assassination of a Hamas leader in Iran. Is a broader war ahead?
We don't want any war at all. But if Israel is capable, absolutely. When you're fighting for your life, you give it everything you've got, and that's always been our secret.
Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro orders an election audit after allegations that he stole his country's presidential election.
Every single state was drastically wrong.
Federal changes on gender identity are now in effect in over half of American states.
That means that biological women are going to have to share bathrooms, locker rooms, showers with biological men who identify as females. They're going to have to share participation on athletic teams. They're going to have to share participation and access to, say, single-sex residence halls.
Deja vu? 87 years ago, FDR wanted to pack the U.S. Supreme Court. Now Biden wants to make some radical changes.
It was a bonehead idea.
And it's all right here on the global lane. A top Hamas leader is dead in Iran, and world leaders fear the Middle East is on the precipice of a major regional war. Iran blamed Israel for an airstrike in Tehran that killed Ismail Haniyeh and has vowed revenge. It comes only 4 days after Hezbollah launched Iranian-made drone rockets that killed 12 children in the Israeli town of Majd al-Shams. Israel responded to that strike with a drone attack in Beirut that killed a Hezbollah commander. Joining us with more is Fleur Hassan Nahum, Israel's Foreign Ministry Special Envoy. Fleur, thank you for joining us. First, our hearts and prayers go out to the Druze families who lost their loved ones in that Hezbollah drone attack. I can't imagine as a parent sending your kids out to play in a soccer field and having missiles strike them down. Now the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Iran, Israel's conflict with Hamas and Hezbollah may soon escalate into a broader war. So how capable is Israel to manage a two, maybe even a three-front war, Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran?
Well, it's not ideal, as you can imagine. We didn't want any of this. On the 7th of October, we were brutally attacked from the south. And on the 8th of October, they started attacking us from the north, which is reminiscent of all the different wars that Israel has had to fight for its existence from 1948, when all the Arabs' armies around the region, all the neighboring Arab countries, attacked Israel in the hope of destroying Israel. But we have essentially Iranian proxies trying to destroy the state of Israel. And like in 48 and 67 and 73, when we were incredibly outnumbered, and in those days, we were also out firepowered. We didn't have the military that we have today, and we won those wars. And if we have to fight a multi-front war, we will fight a multi-front war. We don't want any war at all. But if Israel is capable, absolutely. When you're fighting for your life, you give it everything you've got, and that's always been our secret.
Well, what must be done then to prevent an escalation?
Well, the first thing that Hezbollah should do is actually go to the resolution 1701, which was the UN resolution that was signed at the end of the 2006 war. All they have to do is really comply with an agreement they signed, and that is to go and take their troops behind the Litani River, which means it gives Israel a buffer zone between Hezbollah and our border. What's been happening since October 8th, we have had to mass evacuate. At the beginning, 100,000 people. Now it stands at 60, 70,000 people from the north, 10 kilometers from the border. And we've done something that we've never had to do, and that is create a buffer zone within our country and not outside our country. We need to get back to the point that we return our displaced people back to their homes, and that we have enough of a buffer zone with Hezbollah to protect our communities in the north.
Well, we know that missile that killed those 12 children in Majd al-Shams was made in Iran, and Iran sent about 150 ballistic and cruise missiles directly from Iran against Israel back in April. We can't forget that. And now they're funding and have been continuing to fund and arm Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis against Israel and her allies, as you mentioned. So what needs to be done then to stop Iran from spreading this violence in the Middle East?
Well, first of all, the West has to accept that Iran is the problem. Remember, at the beginning of this administration, we had another attempt at cutting a deal with them. These people are genocidal jihadists. And so the last thing America has to do is try and get towards a deal with Iran. They should be isolated. We should have maximum pressure. And we should actually think about regime change in Iran, which is something that the Iranian people, 80% of the Iranian people, want regime change in Iran. And that's what we should be working towards. Because otherwise, everything else going on, whatever Israel's doing and whatever America helps us to do, is whack-a-mole. Because everything goes back to Iran.
Well, how might these two assassinations then affect Israel's effort to get American and Israeli hostages back? I guess ceasefire talks are unlikely to proceed now.
Well, that's a good point. I'm not sure what's going to happen now to the hostage negotiations, which is very sad for those families who have been relentlessly advocating for a deal to get their loved ones home. So I'm not sure what happens now in terms of the hostage negotiations. But I still think that the pressure on Hamas now, with the number two political person, the guy who brings them the money, the guy that brings them international allies, that guy is now gone. I'm hoping that Yahya Sinwar, who is the mastermind of all of this, will now feel the pressure, will now feel the isolation in order to perhaps want to save his own neck and make a deal with Israel.
Well, it sounds like he wants to be a martyr. To American politics, it looks like Kamala Harris is going to be the Democrats' presidential nominee. How concerned are you about her stance on Israel, and what difference would selecting Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, a Jew, as her vice president make on her Israel policy?
Well, Josh Shapiro is a well-known Israel ally. He is somebody who is very happy to call himself a proud Zionist. And so I'm very happy that he's being considered. We need good people. We need people who understand who their real allies are. I believe that Vice President Kamala Harris made a mistake by not going to the speech of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. At that point, she's chose the fringe and not the center. And this is really, I think, ultimately not good for her electoral hopes. But I hope she understands that the real enemy here is Islamic fundamentalism. And it troubles me deeply when I saw a little clip of her 3 days ago speaking to a Muslim audience saying, I don't believe in Islamic fundamentalism. I don't believe in using that word. So I don't understand really what her stance is. I'm not sure anybody really understands what her stance is on foreign policy in the Middle East. But somebody like Josh Shapiro could really help her.
Okay, Fleur Hassan Nahum, Israel's Foreign Ministry Special Envoy, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
When is a win not a win? Perhaps in Venezuelan presidential politics. Although the main opposition party, led by Maria Corina Machado, claimed it won more than 70% of the votes in the election there, the election council declared President Nicolas Maduro the winner. He'll now start a third six-year term. Venezuelans showed their displeasure by taking to the streets and rioting in Caracas. Well, joining us with more is Juan Pablo Valasmil. He's from a Venezuelan immigrant family. He's a Young Voices commentator and writer for The Spectator magazine. Juan, it's good to talk with you again. So did Maria Corina Machado and her party actually win the vote? She says she has evidence they won more than 70% of the ballots.
They definitely did. As someone who grew up in Venezuela for the first 16 years of my life, Chavismo has slowly but surely died off. The votes that were announced by the Electoral Commission, which, by the way, is headed by a person who was a deputy from Maduro's party, Elvis Amoroso, just make absolutely no sense. They're starkly false. We're not talking about, like, let's say in the U.S., like, oh, maybe there was fraud in one state or two states. Every single state was drastically wrong. The three biggest polls, most respected polls in Venezuela, showed that the opposition candidate, who's Edmundo Gonzalez, who's basically the replacement of Maria Corina Machado, which the regime didn't let her run, and they were trying to jail half of her team. They're now in the Argentinian embassy in Caracas, actually.
Let's talk about that, because I know Venezuelans are upset. They've taken to the streets. What is life like for them under Maduro? They don't want it anymore.
No, they don't. And what's really funny when I talk to some of like the college Marxist crowd is that they tend to see, in people like me, they go like, you don't speak for Venezuela because you're white, or you don't speak for Venezuela because you're a rich and you live in Miami. So they have this image, and they have the same with Cubans, that we don't know what we're talking about. But when you look at the videos, there's a Chavistification process being led by the poorest of the poor in Venezuela. They've been shoved through their throats this Chavismo and this mythical, quasi-religious admiration of this socialist figure. And more than 20 statues of the socialist leader have been torn down. And when you look at the videos, go Google it. When you look at the videos, the people that are doing this are not doing it in like the pretty side of town. This is in the ugly neighborhoods. This is in the barrios, in the slums. The people, the Venezuelan people, are tired. They're fed up. And that's why Nicolas Maduro, there's no way he won. He lied, and not by like a few thousands, by millions and millions of votes. It's impossible, mathematically impossible, that he won.
Well, how does this affect the United States then, and how should the Biden administration respond?
Well, I don't even know how to talk to the Biden administration. They've been extremely incompetent in regard to Venezuela. They have the worst Venezuela policy imaginable. If I can go back for a little, Biden removed the sanctions on their oil sector if they promised to democratize. And then repeatedly, they didn't democratize. They tried to jail their opposition. And of course, they did all the things that they always do. And then they threatened to annex Guyana. And then they weaponized migration. And they do all these things. And Biden didn't put the sanctions back. There was no pressure, only concessions. And I'm not against negotiating. But if you're going to negotiate with Maduro, please know who you're negotiating with. It seems like Biden doesn't, or well, his handlers don't. And very concretely, Venezuela affects U.S. national interest, because you know who cares about Venezuela? China, Russia, and Iran. Actually, the country that has the highest level of strategic partnership with China in the Western Hemisphere is Venezuela. Venezuela is the biggest ally of China, the biggest ally of Russia. That's why Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping were super fast in congratulating Maduro. They were actually faster than Lula da Silva and AMLO and a lot of other Latin Americans. They were super, super fast. Why? Well, I know why. It's because the largest military presence Russia has since the Cuban Missile Crisis is in La Orchila Island in Venezuela. And it's because Venezuela has $2 trillion worth of critical minerals. And you know who wants those minerals? China.
Concerning the U.S. presidential election, you recently wrote that it's time for the Republicans to go negative. No more Mr. Nice Guy. Why do you suggest they do that? Why?
In my opinion, Republicans need to decrease the public display of optimism. They need to stop talking about how we're leading in all the polls. Voters need to fear a Kamala presidency. And as a strategist, I would say this has to be properly illustrated. The left is talking about Project 2025, the spooky Project 2025. Well, Republicans should be doing the same. We don't have a name yet. We don't have a monster yet. But if I were a strategist, I would create that monster. I would connect Kamala Harris with all the other radical groups that exist that are truly radical and want to redefine what America means, want to open the borders and change the country entirely. But we need a name. Republicans need a name. I don't know what it is. Go figure it out.
Well, maybe you can help them figure one out. Juan Pablo Villasmil, Young Voices commentator with The Spectator. Thank you, Juan, for being with us and sharing your insights.
Thank you very much for having me.
Biden administration Title IX changes adding gender identity as a protected group are now in effect. However, federal courts have issued preliminary injunctions against the new regulations in 14 states. So what does it mean for girls and women, college sports, locker rooms, at least for now in 36 other states? We'll hear with more is attorney Ken Tashi. He's higher education fellow at Campus Reform. Ken, remind us what this change to Title IX means for schools, sports, and locker rooms.
Hey, good morning, Gary. Thanks very much for having me. Well, the change in the federal regulations is going to have a direct and significant impact for girls and for women, both in elementary, secondary, and higher education. And under the new regulations, there's been a variety of changes that are going to be impacting biological men that identify as females, and they're going to have access to all activities and programs in the educational setting. And that's significant because that means that biological women are going to have to share bathrooms, locker rooms, showers with biological men who identify as females. They're going to have to share participation on athletic teams. They're going to have to share participation and access to, say, single-sex residence halls. So there's a whole host of events that are going to domino as a result of the implementation of these new regulations.
Ken, I know you follow the legal aspects of this. So the new regulations are in effect in 36 states. Are they going to wait to see what happens in those federal cases in the 14 states before they move full steam ahead implementing the change?
No, they're not. As of today, August 1st, the regulations are going to be implemented in those states where preliminary injunctions have not been entered. And I think now the injunctions have gone up to about 20 states. So in those states where injunctions have been issued, those institutions in those states will act under the existing Title IX regulations. In those states where no injunctions have been issued, then those states will be acting under the new regulations. And really what that's going to result in is a patchwork of enforcement of Title IX across the country, which is going to make compliance and enforcement extremely difficult.
Well, that means 3/4 of the states are moving forward with this. So what would happen to schools that don't abide by the new gender regulations?
In those states where preliminary injunctions have not been issued, those institutions as of today are going to be required to follow the new regulations. And if they refuse to or fail to comply with those new regulations, they're subject to a violation of Title IX and a federal lawsuit and potential loss of, among other things, federal funding.
Ken, how can we protect privacy rights and the rights of women, but at the same time also not discriminate and mistreat transsexuals?
Well, I think, look, I mean, the reality is that when this law was enacted back in 1972, it was implemented specifically to address discrimination and inequities based on sex and education against biological women, period. That was the intent and purpose of the law. If Congress wants to change the original intent of that law, it can do so tomorrow. It can put forward a bill. It can pass that bill through the House and the Senate, and the president can sign that bill. But modifying an existing federal law in the manner in which the Department of Education has done so is a gross deviation from its authority and exceeds its authority under federal law. And at this point, if Congress wants to act, that is the appropriate mechanism, but not through an overreach by a federal agency.
It seems like the agency is acting legislatively, and that's unconstitutional, right?
Well, indeed, and there are specific authorities that these agencies have, and let me also point out that it's very important. A couple of weeks ago, that the Supreme Court ruled in what was known as the Chevron case, where it overruled over 40 years of precedent where federal courts would defer to the interpretation of regulations by federal agencies. So prior to the most recent ruling by the Supreme Court, federal courts would have to defer, in this case, the Department of Education's interpretation of Title IX and its extension to protections over gender identity. Now, with that law being repealed, or that decision being repealed, federal courts will now be in the position to interpret Title IX, its original intent, scope, and purpose, and then make a judicial decision as to whether these regulations fit within the original intent of Title IX or exceed the authority that the Congress implemented back in 1972. And I think that's why these preliminary injunctions have been so successful, because I think courts are looking at the effort by DOE to expand Title IX, and they've said, wait, that's way beyond the original scope and scale of the protections previously provided for.
And quickly, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are political polar opposites on this. So how likely are gender identity and Title IX to be an issue in the presidential campaign?
I think it's going to be a significant issue. Obviously, and correctly, they have very different opinions on this. And again, I want to underscore the importance here of putting the authority back in Congress to make decisions about federal law. Every year or every 4 years, it's like a ping pong match where a new administration comes in and modifies or alters existing regulations, and there is absolutely no certainty within higher education every 4 years as to how they are supposed to interpret and enforce Title IX. So that's another reason why we need to get a federal agency out of the interpretation process and put that back in the hands of Congress or the courts.
Okay, back and forth. That's where we are now. Ken Tashi, Higher Education Fellow at Campus Reform. Good talking with you again, Ken. Thanks for being with us.
Gary, thanks very much for your time.
Now that he's a lame duck, look for President Biden to try to implement changes he won't have to be accountable for with voters in the next election. This week, Biden announced his plan to permanently alter the U.S. Supreme Court by placing 18-year term limits on the justices, and by granting presidents the authority to appoint a new justice to the court every 2 years. That means if a president served 2 terms, he'd appoint 4 justices, nearly half the court. Biden says he wants to prevent the court from being radically altered by any single presidency. But how would one president appointing almost half the court not radically alter the makeup of the court? Biden also wants to impose a tough code of ethics on the court, a standard that is not required of the Congress or president. Let me remind you, we already have a remedy for justices, members of Congress, and presidents who violate ethical standards. It's called impeachment and ouster. That is a solution built into the Constitution by our founding fathers. Biden also wants a law against presidential immunity. In light of the recent Supreme Court ruling, any such law would likely be ruled unconstitutional. It would weaken the presidency and would mean presidents could be prosecuted for any action during their presidency deemed criminal, like assassinating a foreign terrorist like Osama bin Laden. Be careful, Mr. President. That one could eventually be used against you. Here's how Senator Joe Biden in 1983 described FDR's attempted changes to the Supreme Court.
President Roosevelt clearly had the right to send to the United States Senate and the United States Congress a proposal to pack the court. It was totally within his right to do that. He violated no law. He was legalistically absolutely correct, but it was a bonehead idea.
Yes, Mr. President, a bonehead idea back then and still bonehead today. Well, that's it today from the Global Lane. Be sure to follow us on the CBN News and NRB channels, YouTube, iTunes, and our broadcast affiliates. Until next time, be blessed.